Good morning. My name is Richard Lancaster and I'm a volunteer with Greenpeace, and I'd like to thank you for inviting me to give this pre-recorded talk to you today. I'm a volunteer with Greenpeace and I thought I'd just start by telling you a little bit about how Greenpeace started. Greenpeace started back in 1971 when a group of Canadians and Americans, and that group is shown in this picture here, were concerned because the American government wanted to test a nuclear bomb off the coast of Alaska, and the map of the world there shows you in red where Alaska is, and then the other map shows you a little red dot where a place called Amchitka is. And they wanted to blow up a bomb under the sea. And so this group of Canadians and Americans, they hired the ship that's shown there, the fishing boat, and their idea was to sail to where they were going to blow up the bomb and try and stop them blowing up the bomb. And so that's where the very first Greenpeace campaign. Now, since then, Greenpeace has been involved in campaigning on lots of different things. And today, we campaign about climate change. We campaign about air pollution. That's, you can see in that photograph, the exhaust fumes coming out of a car, which are very, very bad for us, for what we breathe, and it's especially noticeable around schools and things like that. We defend the oceans, and that shows a picture of a whale, and whales are in danger because people are still trying to kill whales. We safeguard bees because our bee population is very important. They pollinate lots of our food. We're trying to protect our forests, and forests are being cut down all around the world, and you've probably heard about the forests in the Amazon being cut down. We campaign about single-use plastics, and we also campaign to try and get more people using renewable energy. That's energy from the sun and the wind. Now, the people who are in Greenpeace are just ordinary people like you and me and your parents, your teachers, your grandparents. And this is just some pictures from the group that I belong to. I belong to a Greenpeace group in Bristol, and these are some pictures of me and my friends. And in the top of the middle there, you can see my wife, and I'm standing next to her dressed as a gorilla. That was campaigning about climate change and the threat to things like gorillas. And one of my friends dressed as a polar bear there. And then me and some of my friends dressed as penguins, campaigning to try and protect the Arctic. And finally, me dressed as a monkey, campaigning about the Amazon. Now, today's talk is about the oceans. And the oceans cover nearly 80% of the Earth's surface and are home to half the world's biodiversity. And biodiversity, it's a long word, but basically it means the different types of species and the different varieties of animals and fish and so on. And the oceans are really important because they help regulate our climate, and they also provide food and the livelihoods and jobs for many millions of people around the globe. Now, there are two big threats to the oceans. The first is what we call climate change, and the second is plastics. And I'm going to talk a lot about plastics, but to begin with, I just want to talk a little bit about climate change. Now, climate change is the world's warming up, and it's warming up because we're burning fossil fuels. And fossil fuels are things like coal and oil and gas. And we burn them to generate electricity, and that's what those pictures of those chimneys are. That's a power station making electricity. And we also burn oil and in our cars in the form of petrol and diesel, and we use that to get around. And the problem is that the climate change, by burning these fossil fuels, is damaging the oceans. What actually happens is when we burn fossil fuels, we generate a gas called carbon dioxide, or CO2, and that's absorbed by the oceans, and it makes the oceans more, what we call more acidic, so they're more acidy, and that kills off the life in the oceans slowly. And this is a picture of the sort of thing that happens in the oceans as a result of climate change. And it's two pictures of a coral, and the picture on the left is a healthy coral, and you can see it's a sort of a reddy brown colour. And then the coral on the right is all white, and it's white because it's what we call bleached, and it's basically dead. So climate change is killing the oceans, and we need to try and stop burning fossil fuels. And one of the ways we can do that is trying to save energy and use alternative types of energy instead of using coal and oil and gas. And you can help in that way. You can make sure that you don't waste things. And if we get out of our cars and we cycle or walk, or even if we take the bus or a train, they're much better than going in private cars and aeroplanes. And also it's important to try and save electricity. So we switch things off when we're finished, like the lights and the TVs and computers and video games. And then we don't waste electricity, and we don't burn as much oil and coal and gas, and we don't cause as much climate change. And also around the house, there's other things you can do to try and reduce climate change. One is to make sure you don't waste energy. So if you're heating the house in winter, then don't have loads of windows open so all the heat goes out. Also, if you take a shower instead of having a bath, use a lot less water, and you don't have to heat as much up, so you don't waste it. And also, if you're able to, if you can fit solar panels on your house, so maybe your mum or dad or your parents or guardians or whatever might have already done that, and some of you might have solar panels already on your house, and I've got some on my house, then that helps generate electricity from the sun, and it means that you don't have to burn as much oil and coal and gas to get your electricity. And the other thing you can do is to eat food that's grown locally, because that means that there's not as much lorries and trucks taking the food around the country and between one country and another, and that saves on the burning of fuel, and it therefore helps to save climate change. And also we can eat less but better local meat, because meat is actually a contributor to climate change. And maybe another day I'll explain to you what the link between those two are. But today, climate change is one thing, but the other thing I really want to talk about today is plastics. But first of all, I'm going to just remind you of something. I wonder if some of you have read the story Dear Greenpeace. If you have, you'll know the story, but if you haven't, then it's a story about a little girl called Emily, and she finds a whale in her garden pond. And she's not sure what to do about this whale, so she writes to Greenpeace. And that's why the book's called Dear Greenpeace, because all of her letters start Dear Greenpeace. And she writes to Greenpeace asking for advice about how to look after this whale in a garden pond. So I wonder if you can identify, a little bit of a quiz now, can you identify these different things? Have a look at the pictures and see if you know what they all are. So have a look, there's 5 pictures. And also, looking at those 5 pictures, which one's the odd one out? So what have we got? I'm sure you recognise the first one is a turtle, and then the next one in the middle is a whale, and then there's a person swimming. Below the whale there's a dolphin, but I wonder if you knew what the other one was, the fish. Do you know what sort of fish it is? Some people think it's a piranha or something like that, but actually it's a tuna. So some of you might eat tuna. So that's a tuna fish. So we've got a turtle, we've got a whale, we've got a person, we've got a dolphin, and we've got a tuna. So which is the odd one out? I bet you're all thinking, well, it's obvious really. It's the person. And is that, you said that because all the others live in the sea. But there's another interesting answer. And the other answer could be the tuna, because the others can't breathe underwater. All the others breathe air. The tuna is the only one that breathes underwater through its gills. All the others can't breathe underwater. They have to come to the surface to breathe. Now, why is that important? Well, when we think about the seas, one of the things that we know is that people fish in them and they catch tuna and other things. Now, fishing boats like this one use big nets. Now, many, many years ago, the nets were made out of what we call natural fibres. But these days, all of the nets are made out of plastic. And sometimes when the fishermen are fishing, the nets break and they lose the nets. They fall off the boat and they fall into the sea and they can't get them back. And the problem with plastic is that it lasts forever. So these nets then become what they call ghost nets. They're ghost nets because they're not attached to any boats. And the thing is that wildlife in the seas can get caught in these nets. And if dolphins and turtles and whales get caught in the fishing nets, they drown. They drown just like you or I would if we got held underwater. And so these are two pictures of animals that have been caught up in nets. And so one of the problems that are facing the oceans are these fishing nets, these plastic nets that get discarded or abandoned by fishing boats, and then they just drift around the oceans forever, accidentally catching fish and also catching mammals and reptiles like the turtles and like the dolphins. And as I say, when they get caught in the nets, they can't get out. They can't break the plastic nets because they're so strong, and they end up drowning, just like you or I would if we got caught underwater. So that's one of the dangers facing the oceans, is these plastic fishing nets. But there's another one, and I'm going to explain this a bit by another little bit of a quiz. So I'm going to ask you, if I was to show you this picture and say, what do these companies make? You'd look at those pictures and you'd say, oh, I know what they make. They make breakfast cereals. And of course you'd be right, because they do make breakfast cereals. And here's some pictures of the bowls of cereal, so you recognise those immediately. Now, if I said, what do these companies make? You'd look at those bottles and you'd say, oh, I know what they are. They're bottles of water. So those companies must make water. But of course, you can't make water, can you? Water just exists. You can't make it and you can't destroy it. So if they don't make water, what do? Well, really what they do is make plastic bottles, and they also make pollution. And here's a picture of just the sort of pollution that plastic bottles cause. And that's plastic bottles lying on a beach. Now, we talk about plastic, but it might be helpful just to tell you a little bit about where plastic came from. And plastic was invented over 100 years ago by this chap here. And his name is Dr. Leo Hendrik Baekeland, and he invented the very first plastic, and he called it Bakelite after himself. So he invented it over 100 years ago, and he worked out a very clever way of taking oil, that's that picture, the hand holding some crude oil there. Oil's drilled out of the ground, and it goes to an oil refinery, and then it goes to a plastics factory, and eventually they make little plastic pellets like these yellow and orange and blue plastic pellets. And then those plastic pellets are made into all the things that we make with plastic. And plastic's really good for things like pipes under the ground. So if you're putting water or gas in pipes under the ground, plastic's a brilliant material to make the pipes out of, because plastic never rots and doesn't crack very easily. So it's a very good material for that sort of thing. And also it's really good for making things like vacuum cleaners and hair dryers and stuff like that, because it can be easily moulded into different shapes. It's quite cheap, and it lasts a long time. But the other thing that we now use plastic for is things like these plastic bottles and containers. And the problem with those is that we're using plastic that is only supposed to be is supposed to last forever for things that only last for a very short time. And I've got an idea here from when Mr. Baekeland first invented plastic 100 years ago. To begin with, we didn't make very much plastic, but this bar chart shows you how the amount of plastic that we make each year has gone up and up and up. So up in the 1950s, so the 1950s is probably around the time some of your grandparents were born. I was born in the 1950s, and I've got grandchildren about the same age as you. So I was born in the 1950s. In the 1950s, this bar chart shows you, and that picture, the first picture, shows you a couple who are supposed to kind of look a bit like your grandparents. There wasn't very much plastic being made. And then in the 1980s and early 1990s, that's the second picture, you can see that the amount of plastic has gone up, and that picture's supposed to look a bit like your parents, because a lot of your parents would have been born in the 1980s or 1990s. And then the very last bar on the right there, above a picture of some children similar ages to you or your brothers and sisters, that's just sort of about 6 or 7 years ago, and by then you can see how much plastic we're making, and it's a huge amount compared with the amount that we used to make. And some plastic's great. As I said, it's great for things like pipes in the ground. It's great for toys like Lego, and I guess a lot of you like playing with Lego. Lego's great. You can use it lots of times, and if you get fed up with it, eventually you can pass it on to somebody else and they can get lots of pleasure out of it. But we use plastic that lasts forever for things that we only need to last for a few days. And this sort of plastic is called single-use or disposable plastic, and we use it for plastic bottles and containers for food and for wrappers for things like biscuits and crisps and things like that. And some of the plastic is really, really bad, and it's totally unnecessary. And here are some examples of some really kind of bonkers, stupid plastic. So the first picture on the top there, what it is, it's hard-boiled eggs. And it's actually in a French supermarket. That's why it says œuf rather than eggs. But what's happened there is that some people have hard-boiled the eggs, and then they've peeled the shell off the egg, and then they've wrapped the eggs in plastic to sell them. And then next to that is a picture of some orange segments. And what's happened there is that they've taken an orange, they've peeled it, they've divided all the segments out, laid them out in a plastic tray, and then put plastic around them to sell them. And all that does is to save you peeling the orange yourself. And then somebody's done the same with the apple slices, so that instead of just eating the apple, you buy it in a plastic packet. And then in the bottom there's some other crazy things. Apples in tubes, Coca-Cola can in a plastic container. There's carrots that are wrapped in plastic, and lemons wrapped in plastic. And the last two are bananas. One of them is a single banana in plastic, and then the other one is two peeled bananas wrapped in plastic. And these are all what we call unnecessary plastics. So they're plastics that we shouldn't really have at all. But the problem is that these days in supermarkets, they wrap nearly everything in plastic. And this shows a shelf in a supermarket with all of that plastic on the shelves. And that means that there are now about 8.3 billion tonnes of plastic in the world. And that plastic, a lot of it ends up in the wrong place. What happens is we put the plastic into our litter, then some of it we wash down the plug hole because it gets caught up with the washing up, and it gets washed down. And some of it goes to landfill, which is where your rubbish goes, to the rubbish tip, and then it blows out to sea. And well, what happens then? Well, I've got a little video here, and it's a little trip to an aquarium, but the trip didn't turn out quite as well as the children hoped it would.
I'm excited to see the penguins.
I want to see the otters.
I love the octopus.
I'm excited to see the catfish.
should be millions of fish and 0% of plastic.
So that shows you a trip to an aquarium, and obviously the children saw the plastic where they should have been fish. Now, some of the plastic washes up on beaches, and this is a picture showing a beach polluted by single-use plastic. And the trouble is that the plastic often looks like food to animals and birds. Plastic bags floating around in the ocean actually look a bit like a jellyfish, and jellyfish are one of the things that turtles like to eat. So that turtle has mistaken a plastic bag for a jellyfish and is trying to eat it. And then these two seabirds have found, one of them's found the ring, the sort of the ring binder from a 6-pack of beer or cans, and the other one has got a little party popper container that it thinks is food and is trying to eat it. And then some of the things cause problems. There's a picture of a bird there that's died having eaten plastic. There's a picture of a diver rescuing a seal from being caught in a plastic net. And the turtle there, I wonder if you can see what's happened there. What's happened is that a baby turtle has got caught in one of those plastic binders from a 6-pack, and it hasn't been able to escape. And as its shell's grown, the shell has grown around the plastic so that it's all deformed now because of the plastic. So what can we do about it? Well, one of the things we can do is to try and make sure that the plastic doesn't end up in the ocean. And we can do that by making sure we recycle it. And if we recycle, we can make new things out of the old plastic. We can make blankets and bags, and garden furniture, and household utensils. And this picture here, the red arrows show that if you just put all of your rubbish into the rubbish bin, it'll end up in landfill and it'll end up in the rivers and the sea. But if you wash it out and put it in the recycling bin, it can be made into new things. But the problem is recycling is not perfect, because this shows you what a recycling factory actually looks like, and you can see that it's quite dirty and messy, and the people are having to sort out the plastic that can be recycled from the plastic that can't. And part of the problem is we're just generating too much plastic. This here is a picture of a whopping pile of plastic bottles, and this is just from one day's recycling collection in Bristol. So that is the number of plastic bottles that are recycled every day in Bristol. And the problem is that recycling, you can't recycle things indefinitely. Indefinitely means time and time again with no limit. Now, aluminium and steel and glass, you can recycle indefinitely, but paper and plastic, you can't. And plastic, you can only recycle it about 7 to 9 times, but sometimes it's as little as 2 times before you end up putting it into landfill. Now, in different parts of the world, they're finding different ways to use plastic. And in places in Africa and in South America, they're sometimes using these things called eco bricks, which are plastic bottles packed with plastic, and they're using them as bricks to build houses and other buildings. But we don't really do that in Britain. I mean, there's a few things you can do. You can use a few of them for planters and bird feeders and so on. But really, what we have to do is to try and reduce the amount of plastic that we're generating. We need to be like this young lady here, and we have to refuse disposable plastic. So how can you help? Well, one of the things you can do is to make sure that you don't buy any bottled water, because bottled water is one of the worst things. Just carry your own water bottle, and I guess most of you bring your own water bottle to school anyway. And if you're out and about and you see that refill sign, you can get your bottle refilled for free. And say no to plastic straws, and take your own reusable bottle if you're going to a takeaway cafe, so that you get just your own cup refilled rather than getting a takeaway one. If you do buy a fizzy drink, it's much better to buy it in a glass bottle or an aluminium can, because glass and aluminium can be recycled properly lots of times. But if you get it in a plastic bottle, it can be recycled, but only so many times. And also, if you're taking sandwiches out for a picnic or bringing sandwiches to school, try and use a reusable sandwich bag or a bees wrapping instead of cling film, because cling film is just plastic that will end up in rubbish, whereas these can be used time and time again. They can be washed and reused. And also try and avoid things that contain plastic, like liquid soaps in plastic bottles and wet wipes, which contain plastic and are really bad. And instead just use a bar of soap, and then you save on the plastic. And also party balloons are really bad, especially if they're filled with helium, the ones that go up in the air, because they end up washing out to sea like this. And eventually they'll burst and they'll sink down and they'll look like food for a poor old turtle who'll try and eat it. And the other thing you can do is to try and avoid the supermarkets and go to shops like this one. This one is where I live in Nailsea, but there's shops like this all round now springing up. And this is called a zero waste shop. So instead of going there and everything already being wrapped up in plastic, you take your own container and they fill it up with whatever you want. So there's no waste, there's no plastic. And also, if you can go to an old-fashioned greengrocer, then a lot of the stuff there is loose rather than being wrapped in plastic. Not all of it, there is still some plastic, but quite a lot of it is loose, and you can take your own bags to buy stuff. And then the other thing you could do is to make people aware of the problem, and you could do that by maybe designing a poster or something like this. And a lot of schools are also becoming plastic-free schools. And here's some pictures of some schools which are plastic-free zones. And finally, it's important to remember what we call the 4 R's. The first one is refuse. So that means don't buy things unless you really need them, because everything you buy that you don't need just will end up as being wasted. Reduce, that means try and use as little as you can, and make sure that you save things, so that don't waste electricity, for instance. So this shows a picture of a light switch being switched off. That will save with climate change, and it'll help. Reuse means using things time and again if you can. So this is a picture of your own shopping bag. So you take your own cloth bag to get your shopping in, rather than getting a plastic bag that will end up being thrown away. But if you have finished with something and you can't use it anymore, make sure you wash it out and put it in the right recycling, so that it can be made into something new. Right, thanks for listening. I hope that your marine sort of study day work goes really well, and that you enjoyed the short talk about the oceans. These are my contact details, so if your teachers want to get in contact with me, they can do. Thanks for listening.